Great, and thank you everyone who's still stayed for the last session. And this is really the concluding sort of panel. Partly I'd like to leave it a little bit free so that you can reflect on things that you would like to say. Partly I would also like to put you on the spot and ask you to give some visions of where we need to go. The theme of this whole symposium is moving ahead, exploring social transformations in the age of migration. We've had several excellent but quite dense presentations, a lot to take in, a lot to think about, so many questions coming out of that. But I think I'd like to sort of step back from the really interesting research and maybe just reflect a bit on what I perceived as three things that I'd like you to comment on. The first is that all of you mentioned sort of the racialized, gendered elements of this. Some of the presentations also mentioned the broader political economy, the inequality in the world system, the economic system specifically. So I have a question to you in terms of where do you see as the big gaps in terms of critical migration studies? Gabrielle, yourself, you started saying, migration scholars are loath to talk about labor mobility crime. So where are the gaps in that? The second question I would ask of you is, what do you see as the role of academia or academics and scholars and researchers beyond academia? Thomas, you sort of really talked about the work you were doing in Canada and with more activist sort of leanings. And so where and how do we engage with activists, with policymakers, with stakeholders beyond just sort of the academic circles that we're in? And then just going back to something that Stephen said in the morning about one of the big failures is that a lot of migration work is only about migration. And so we fail to connect to some of the broader issues. So what do you see then as what we need to do in terms of research to affect change beyond migration, with the understanding that we are still affecting migration by doing so? Three big questions. It's also three questions that I put to the audience, because I think it would be also very good to get from you thoughts about where the gaps are, where we should be going, what our roles and responsibilities lie in the work we do. Would anyone like to start on any or all of the questions? Again, it's nice for me to be able to say that I am not a migration scholar, so I can ask the questions. I'm just going to make sure you get the mic.
I will take the microphone. Just a couple of different thoughts. One is about the gaps in critical migration, or kind of on the research agenda. I think one issue, I don't consider myself a migration scholar. So I'm a sociologist of punishment, studying the welfare state.
Right.
So I came from it from a very different perspective. But one issue I'm concerned about with the way the research is developing, we talk about silos, that people are in their own silos talking to themselves. So the cross-disciplinary discussion can be really difficult. Yeah. And we were talking about before about who's your audience, what are you responsible for, how do we communicate this? So is it even possible to do interdisciplinary or transdisciplinary migration research, and what would that entail? Does that mean a collaborative research project? Because there's a lot, I think we actually know quite a lot. But how has it been communicated across the disciplines, and how has it been communicated to the publics?
Right.
So I actually think the gap is not necessarily in funding. I shouldn't really say this either, but I don't think the problem is actually funding research. It's actually dialogues and discussions from bottom up with the public, and a much more inclusive kinds of discussions. So I'll just answer your other question there about the role of academics, is because I actually think we know I mean, others I'm sure can identify other gaps. I think we know a lot about the big picture, about global inequality, about these exclusionary mechanisms. I think there's research in all these dimensions. Academia can be much more involved in sociology. Maybe 10 years ago, we talked about the role of public sociology, and there was a debate about that. Should we be scientists in our office, or should we take on different kinds of roles? And there was a shift towards more public engagement, which had been thought of before as kind of something you didn't mess with that. It was really problematic. So I think I think that there's different roles, right, in terms of public communications, about doing the things that Gabriella was talking about with these young people, like actually doing things on the ground to involve young people in the research of the migration, of the smuggling. I'm involved in this project with Border Criminologies, which we're starting this, I laugh because it's in its infancy, but a video project of trying to capture key ideas and communicate them through social media. But I think that there's a lot more communication and interaction with a broader idea about the public, I think, is one step, or I think, a glaring gap in this area.
Great.
Oh, can I just add to that? I mean, I agree with all of that. I mean, she kind of stole my points that I was going to say, but said them probably better than I could. But but one of the major ones is a bit what I was saying earlier, but I just want to emphasize that. And with respect to the role of the academic, is I do think popular engagement at a certain level, writing editorial pieces, writing things that are aimed to general audiences, to say, here are all the myths, here are all the facts. And I think actually a number of our papers, especially the last two, you all did a very good job, I think, of like, here are the myths, here are the facts. Like, I really when I teach this stuff, I'd like to have those things of like, let's have a conversation, but we need to be on the same page. I feel like so much of what your all work's doing, but mine as well, and is just damage control off of media misrepresentations. Like, God, why is this going on? Like, academics don't have significant disagreements on some of these things. There's finer points to debate, but in general, we're basically on the same page about the facts. Hence the need, I think, for social media and popular articulations by academics. And then the other one, just to emphasize and show agreement, is critical immigration studies. Like, the thing is, like, we all, there's a lot of people doing work, and it's incredible. Like, I feel like I learn something new all the time, but I don't have a good sense actually of what the whole picture is. Like, maybe, I don't know what the gaps are, I guess is what I'm saying, is in part because I don't know what is all out there. So meetings like this, conferences like this, I learned so much, and I feel like critical immigration studies is sort of just getting a sense of itself. Like, what are we? What do we know? And then I guess I'm not prepared to say what the gaps are yet, because I'm not sure I have a total grasp on the full interdisciplinary scope of critical immigration studies. So in addition to the popular writing and just damage control on media misrepresentations, is also political activism as allies. I don't think it's necessarily up to academics to like come up with some kind of vision of what people should do. That's up to people. That's not up to us. I think there's pressure often. I've given a couple interviews where people have asked, well, so what should we do? Like, what's the answer? I'm like, that's not I'm not here to give you answers. That's not the role of the intellectual. Answers come from people. They come from groups. So I would just say, as my activist experience in Toronto was a very fulfilling one, in part because it was driven by the demands of the migrants there. And there were a group of allies. So the activist group was just the ally, as a group of allies responding to the needs of the community that needed help being articulated. And it's a very vulnerable position to be in, to be a public activist. Like, you can't, if you're undocumented, that's very precarious. So academics, intellectuals can play roles as allies, but need to be responsive to the needs, and not just, how can I write a paper using this group or something like that, is you sort of have to be there for those people first. And the last one was, how do we move beyond just immigration?
But before you answer that, can I just quickly jump in? So you said a role with media, you said a role with activists. Do you see, or have you had a role with policymakers?
I don't know anything about policy making, but there's definitely, there are people who do immigration policy and study. It's not my field, sure. But you're right. That's most certainly something that yeah, I suppose I guess I'm more pessimistic on that side of things. I mean, I think it's very important, but yeah, I've sort of, I guess, oriented myself more for the ground up, but like policy is.
And we can't be everything to everyone.
That's right.
Sorry, you can go on.
No, that's it. I'm finished.
Okay. Yeah, well, I would echo a lot of what's been said. I am also not, don't identify as critical migration studies, but I think one thing is to note that there are a lot of people doing work to do with migration, or potentially to do with migration in many fields, so that in a way to bring people together and dialogue with each other is really important, as you're doing here. One thing that I've been thinking about lately, especially as our president, not to be named, is moving in ever more fascist directions, is the importance of research on the right internationally, and I feel that could be very useful. I think it's probably happening, but to really be more intentional about the anti-immigration strategies and languages and discourses, not only in Europe and the United States, in Australia, in South Asia, where you have, right-wing populist government in India, and then, migration from Bangladesh and the Islamic terrorist / climate change, discourse. So I think to understand the right strategy, and to the extent that I'm not arguing here that it's some vast conspiracy, and obviously, but there are ties, and to understand their strategic use of media, strategic use of narratives and images might help us better to intervene and try to come up with alternative ones. And I guess as somebody who's always straddled activism and academics, I've never thought of the two as separate. And I do think too, writing, we're all trained in writing, and it's really important to write opinion pieces and be able to also speak to more popular groups, and to take, guidance and leadership from activist groups. But in the early stages of my career, I was part of kind of a feminist group called Committee on Women, Population, and the Environment. It was mainly US-based, but also international, where we were trying to intervene on kind of the population environment discourse, and also fight kind of population control measures at home and abroad. And what was wonderful about this group is that it just felt like it wasn't the activists and the academics working together. We were all activists of a sort, and we were all scholars of a sort. Mm-hmm. And I define scholarship broadly. Mm-hmm. And also I found working with the Indian women's health movement too, to be a wonderful thing. And so I just feel like sometimes we make these divisions when they don't need to exist, or they don't exist, or they don't exist within ourselves, but we're taught to think that they do exist within ourselves, I guess. So for me, it's more of a fluid situation. In terms of the academy too, I just wanted to mention, I don't know if this kind of fits into the questions, but I think it's so important, especially in a place like the United States where undocumented people are being, hounded by ICE. So sanctuary cities, obviously sanctuary towns. I'm happy to say our town is a sanctuary town, and people have been taken into sanctuary in churches in our region, but also colleges protecting undocumented students and encouraging undocumented students to attend is really important right now, I think. There's a whole dreamer discourse in the United States, but I think we need to not just focus on that, but also focus on really, there are lots of undocumented students, how to protect them in this area of right-wing attack.
I think that also raises a really important point in terms of that access to education and the more active things that you were talking about in solidarity, because we might make it possible for someone to join an institution, but to help them to actually bridge between where they've been and where they're going into, the different cultures, the language and all of that, takes an active step that we have to think through. Yeah. Gabriella.
And following precisely on that, right before I came to the UI at the MPC, I was at the University of Texas in El Paso, right on the border. And one of my frustrations was that we had scores of people coming in every week as border experts when we had the expertise in our room, in our classrooms. They were our students. And for me, the time that I was there was very important to tell them that you are the experts. Because they had access, if anybody had experienced what it was crossing that bridge every day to go to school and not knowing how long you were going to be held for before they will let you through. If anybody had experienced what it was to feel harassment and intimidation on an everyday basis, being profiled, it was our students, but nobody had acknowledged their experiences as such. I think that is essential, and that is also why I miss teaching, at the MPC so much, because there's that connection and that recognition that comes from valuing the expertise of our students, I think, and also recognizing that such, because many times again it's like, oh, that's what happens to everybody, right? And it never gets the value that it deserves. So that is one of the things that I think we can actually do. They have the knowledge, and they have to occupy those spaces, because that is another thing, I'm of course delighted to be here, but the academic scene once again tends to be very white, very much dominated by white American and white European voices. Migrants are hardly ever invited to our events, as commentators, as respondents, it's great that we get together and that we have these marvelous venues together, but there's again that need of those voices and those spaces. I also see the need for that comparative work, and I actually seen it even more being at the MPC, and also to the experience in the Smuggling Research Collective, how, again, all of these parallels that come across in our research that being so siloed have prevented us from developing. That, and that is also, I think, part of the disciplinary critique on how even within our what would be broadly defined as our field, you see all of these factions. And for example, in my case, developing research on the U.S.-Mexico border, if you don't jump on the wagon of let's talk about violence and organized crime and border porn, then you are really not part of us. If you're not really speaking the securitization language, we don't want you. And that is something that I myself experienced on the border. Every time that we really wanted to bring a more critical take into what the care, support, and solidarity meant, we were immediately crushed by no, but let's talk about the cartel. Again. So having that sort of global and comparative work is also much needed. And lastly, I think I can also talk about our experience with the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime. They were pretty much the ones who came up with the definition of what trafficking and smuggling was all about. When we first came together as a group of people who were doing work on smuggling, we kind of hope, yeah, maybe one day they're going to invite us. And we used to laugh. It's like, of course they will never invite us. We're critical of precisely what they do. We ended up getting that invitation. Now we are actually dealing with another, one thing is again being invited, and another one is being, acknowledged. Yeah. We received support. We put together a couple of publications, and they were blocked by the legal unit because they were too radical, and they never call it radical, right? They said that they would just oppose the views of the member states. But it's been interesting for all of us to negotiate, because what we wrote specifically in those two publications didn't come out, but our work is already part of the global reports. So we lose some ground, and then we gain it in other ways.
Yeah. it's interesting that you talked about the concepts that you people are interested in researching, which basically just reflects our own academic borders that we have amongst ourselves. But yeah, I just maybe wanted to follow up then, you use this example with working with the UN Office on Drugs and Crime. Have the others of you been involved in successful either cross-disciplinary collaborations or even outside with other institutions? If you'd share any examples that have been successful?
On migration particularly?
Well, it doesn't have to be, because I think it would also be good that what we can learn for interdisciplinarity, even from outside, but for migration in the future.
Okay. Well, I could just give one example which is very formative to me, that I worked in Bangladesh in the 1970s at this, and in the mid-1970s I was living in a village and doing research there, and I became involved later through solidarity work in kind of population control programs in Bangladesh, moving in USAID, World Bank, UNFPA in particular. Were urging the Bangladesh government to mount a big sterilization campaign using incentives paid for by USAID. I'm happy to say CEDA and some other groups were better on this issue. But we mounted an international campaign, Bangladeshi activists, solidarity activists, academics, aid workers, to get rid of the sterilization incentives, the U.S. funding, which actually was against the law, and to reform the population policy. Now, it's not like glorious, but we did have some victories, And, but they're strange bedfellows in policy work, as many of you know. For example, at the same time, the anti-abortion movement in the U.S. was taking up the issue of forced sterilization in Bangladesh. They wanted to work with us. So I said politely, no. But they were the ones who got more media coverage of it, which then put more pressure on USAID to get rid of the incentives. So, they're strange bedfellows in this world. So how do you also I learned through that work and further work on population policy, the risks of co-option. Like, you can get invited to events and you can actually be listed as, kind of you're the diversity contingent, right? But what you say can be misrepresented, or you're seen as part of the consensus that comes out of the meeting. And you may very well have raised critical comments, but they don't get reported. So I kind of learned through that activism too that you have to be very careful. It doesn't mean you don't attend such meetings, but you have to be very careful to make sure that people know in advance that you to agree to certain principles. So there's both benefits and risks in policy work, and which isn't to say not to do it, but and actually you can learn quite a lot, I think, doing policy work too, on how people's minds are working. Through exposure to some policy work, I learned in a way that some of these narratives around climate change are strategic, right? That people don't really necessarily believe them, but they'll use them, right? So for me, I'm always like, I'm really a naive person, and I think when people say things, they believe them, right? Or, but to realize how strategic people are in the use of these policy narratives was shocking to me, but also very important to learn. Thanks. Did you want to say?
Small scale, a really small scale example, but I think it's also, we think, let's think big and change the world. But I was involved in a collaborative project maybe 2 years ago now with an architectural firm in Stockholm, and they have a public art mission. And we had this discussion about, they wanted to do things on the border and detention. So I met with them several times to talk about the research on detention, what it's like in there on the border, and the criminalization, and wrote pieces for them, right, in there, ended up in an art catalog, and then helped them organize a public art event in Stockholm where they had to try to communicate what it was like to cross the border. So, and then we had then it was like an open discussion, and I presented part of the work, and then asked the architects to think about designing space for human security. So, and it's something they hadn't thought about at all, right? So they're very interested in how the body moves through space, but for me, the discussions with the architects we usually talk social science, and then we have our kind of usual people that we communicate with, but the people in architecture, they had a whole other language for understanding the way bodies move through space. That's why they were interested in the borders. But then to bring in this layer about how could they design for the future, you know, we were talking about the people's home, how could they make a real people's home that was based on human security? And so it was really fruitful kinds of conversations, and very, you know, kind of small scale, but they did have this public art event after.
I know that as Kisanas, we've also tried to have that sort of connecting between science and art, and have some conversations on topics like climate change, like migration, to bring those two together, and somehow that creative space can really generate new ways of thinking about things. Oh. So I'd like to open it up to the audience, comments, questions, reflections that you might have as well. Is there another? Yeah, okay. If you can shout, that would be. But we can also try and pass this back.
Hi, my name is Naikari, and I work at the Malmo Institute of Migration. And thank you very much for all these interesting contributions. I would like to perhaps also contribute to this latest debate on how can we do more interdisciplinary work in migration studies. So our institute, we have about 40 affiliated researchers, and it is very interdisciplinary. So we have sociologists, mostly political scientists, some historians, anthropologists, etc., a couple of economists. And we also share a common office, so it's a physical space where we meet regularly, almost every day, not all of us, but most of us. And despite all this, there is very, very little collaboration going on among us. And when that happens, it's mostly between people who do qualitative versus quantitative research. So, because there it's, you know, very obvious where you can contribute to each other's work. So that is happening a little bit, but not a lot either. But people who do similar work or work on similar themes, but from different disciplines, let's say anthropologists versus political scientists or sociologists working on the same theme, but let's say doing qualitative work. I think the difficulties in working together in terms of finding a common language, common traditions in writing style are bigger than the perceived benefits. And I also see this in our weekly, we have this weekly seminar series, and we have presentations by staff from Malmo University, but also we have invited speakers. And so most of the comments that people make are very, very disciplinary. So I see that it's very difficult to kind of move beyond your training. So my question would be, how can we do that? How can we improve in this area? Thank you.
Thank you for that very honest sharing, and I think a big question to everyone. Eski, did you have a question? I'm going to park that one because I want to come back to it at the end.
Hey, I'm Ezgi. I'm a PhD student in Göteborg University in political science. Mine would actually go for the things that you said, because I do also think we cannot talk for migrants, but at the same time I caught myself between the idea that, but at the same time, at certain platforms, in order to be heard, you have to know the lingo. And, or maybe you, like we, maybe not as an academic, but also as a practitioner too, we have maybe higher likelihood of being heard. But at the same time, we shouldn't just take the agency of the migrants either. So like, it may, because you said you also mixed somewhat activism with the academic world, like, would you have any kind of experience related to this? Because this is actually what I find very challenging, both as an academic and at the same time, like you said, I just don't want to go talk to people, take the data and leave. I want to give something, but at the same time, I constantly find myself thinking like, but who am I to give something back, not like to devalue, but just, it's. I wonder whether you have anything related to say to this one.
Yeah, I very much feel that problem, and I don't have a direct solution to that. It is a tension that anybody straddling those two worlds faces. From both of those worlds, as an activist, you get seen as an academic outsider there to basically, capitalize and advance your academic career based on field research, whether participatory or no. And then from the academic world, it's like things that have to do with activism are not taken seriously as scholarship. Maybe it's more so in the case of field studies, like you can kind of claim something, but in philosophy, this is like not in my field, that's like, that's not philosophy. That's go do activism. Like that has nothing to do with what we're doing in philosophy, where we contemplate the nature of being and so on. And I have in philosophy, I've just lost all tolerance for that. So now there's a bunch of us, it's called the Radical Philosophy Association. It's just a bunch of Marxist and feminist and, post-colonial scholars and stuff. And now we are all friends, but it's a very small group anyway, so that's just, that's therapeutic, where it's just activist intellectuals that get together and complain about things. But more to the question that you asked, which is how to sort of negotiate that. I would say that in my capacity when I was working as an activist, it was not as an intellectual or an academic coming to study that group. I have activist experience, and so I asked to join and participate and help as best I could, and just whatever they wanted me to do, that's what I did. And it was their campaign. I was simply there to help, not to analyze them and say, look, I've analyzed and here's your way forward. So I didn't contribute in a directional way at all to that, to the work. And I think that's a risk of being an academic, like, oh, I've got the system figured out, let me tell you what to do. I think that we should, at that level, sort of resist that, and as activists, participate as activists, and not think that we have any special insight that can sort of direct the group above and beyond what anybody else has. That said, this is easier for me to say as a philosopher, in part because I wasn't doing field research about the group. And I recognize that it may be different in your situation if you are. So what I did was I did like a roundtable interview, which was just the voices of the primary kind of core activists of that group to tell their story, what's your mission, and then publicize that. And that was my only facilitation role, was just ask some questions, have them answer, and then publish that with a journal that I was associated with that had a wide range of activists and academic stuff. So there are journals that publish that kind of work where you can kind of, that you don't have to be like the academic presenting your research, but it can be more of an engaged dialogue that you have with those activists, so that they can, as a prompt to, but yeah, again, I'm sorry, this doesn't exactly answer your question. I said that I couldn't, in part because if you're actually doing research about the group, it becomes more complicated, but maybe other people have.
No, I wasn't also not looking for a direct answer, because I recognize that it's super complicated, but when we had fieldwork with Mine in Barcelona, we were actually trying to talk to both people that were citizens but at the same time activists. And one academic who became actively involved in that was actually the most skeptical one, kept asking us like, so what are you going to give in return? And what are you going to, there was also this weird challenge. I don't know how.
But sometimes that challenge is not bad, because it forces us to think about it, even if we don't have the perfect answer. Can we hand it to Martin and then to Nicholas?
Yes. First, to the comment about disciplinarity, because I agree very much. It's a big challenge. I don't think there's any ready-made answer for it. But coming out of philosophy, I grew very discontent with the single-mindedness of philosophy. Fieldwork, what is that? It's emerging, So I went interdisciplinary to the dismay of others. But to this day, you can still meet also not only philosophers, people who say, "Oh, don't do that." The moment you spread out, you lose, and then it'll take you a decade to reach a level of expertise that you would have had if you stayed within your discipline. I'm being told this to this day, and I just think that's a lot of, I don't think we should follow that advice. Of course we should be careful, but I think that is a great way to statism. So that was just a comment to you. I have a question, of course, also, and it's about policy work a bit, but also how to navigate in a politicized and polarized society. So I had a meeting at a Danish parliament with a politician who said, you know, where are the migration researchers? There are no migration researchers. And hearing his question, I felt to say, well, you know what, there are more migration research centers in Denmark now than there has ever been before. I can give you the addresses of 30 researchers if you want, but that's not what he was asking. He was saying, where are the people who are confirming my political points? And there weren't many, as you also were saying before, but I think this poses a challenge to us as researchers. It's not just how we interact with policymakers, but how do we break a barrier of people who are willingly looking the other way? And more specifically, who are, and that's my experience, and that's my question, if all of you recognize in different ways how policymakers are increasingly moving away from interaction with academics towards think tanks and consultancies that they can contract to produce the points they are willing to listen to in advance. Do you recognize this challenge?
Lots of nodding heads. Any comments anyone wants to make on that? Betsy, do you want to?
I could make a quick...
Oh, I think your mic's actually
I have this thing on. Yeah, definitely. You know, some of this, the worst kind of climate conflict, climate refugee stuff comes out of climate and security think tanks and defense think tanks. So I totally agree, and contract labor in this way, and the think tanks needing that contract labor to keep going, and needing, especially if they want any defense money, playing the security card. So totally in agreement. Whether it's worse now than it used to be, that would be an interesting question. Because, I mean, at least in the US, there's a long history of these think tanks servicing the defense and foreign aid industry. So I'm just not sure it's worse now than it was, but maybe we don't pay enough attention to it. I don't.
So we'll give the last question to Nicholas.
Just something that I was thinking about. I missed the morning session, so I apologize if it's something that's already been discussed, but kind of implicit in the last two presentations is that when we kind of respond to this, as you mentioned, you feel like you're continually just trying to respond to a litany of falsehoods. But I think the danger here is that we then get caught up into responding on the terms of debate that has been set out by other people. So, I mean, I can think of this as, I mean, when I look at the migrants that I look at, I see this pathology discourse, the idea of the migrants as a pathological disease agent. This implicitly means that they're all the same, right? Because viruses or bacteria are the same. And then we respond by saying, well, no, but they're marginalized. But we still respond by saying they're all the same. So, I mean, the question is, how do we then kind of take charge of the discourse and break that and do something completely different? It's hard, I guess.
Well, there's, I mean, just a short answer here. But, I mean, I think there's lots of academic writing that does. But who's reading the academic writing? I mean, I just also took on this thing about the think tanks. I mean, I read a lot of these government accounting reports in the U.S. government. Like, they have paid researchers. You know, they're not, I guess think tanks is not the right word for them, but they're paid government employees to do research, for instance, on the U.S.-Mexico border wall. And I've read a number of these reports, and they're pretty clear. I mean, some things I'm just like, oh, this is right on. This is what's happening. Like, these people do research on the border, like, oh, it doesn't work. Oh, it's falling apart. It's killing the environment. It's destroying all these species. And I'm like, yeah, it is. These are paid researchers, and like, what is the government doing doing with these reports, I mean, if they're not listening, if they're not even reading their own reports, I actually have a friend in Denver who works for the Forest Service, and they had this big meeting that they had prepared this very thick report for you know, President Trump, and then they were on Skype with him or something. Oh, I'm sorry, the horrible demon. Yeah, you know. On Skype, he took the report and he threw it right in the trash in front of all of them. They'd spent years working on this report. I mean, this is the kind of, the government is actually, they are, I mean, I don't know, it's like the show of research, like, oh, we care enough to study what's actually going on, so we've got this report about what's going on, and then, you know, policymakers and administrators just do whatever the hell they want anyway. Sorry, I'm very pessimistic on the policy stuff, but this is partly why. Even when they pay their own people, they don't even read the stuff. It's like if you know all this stuff, you know that the US-Mexico border is a complete waste of money. It's a humanitarian disaster. Like, this is all in the government's own reports. They recognize all the deaths and atrocities. I mean, not everything, but close enough that you realize this is a terrible kind of thing to put forward and keep maintaining. And yet, there it is. And so I highly doubt that they are reading my academic work or any of our academic work if they're not even reading their own government reports. Sorry, that was cynical.
Well, I just add one thing on this, because I think before we said we shouldn't take that role as experts, that we know what's going on. But I do think there's a responsibility to think about imagining a different future. So there is a strain developing, even in the social sciences, to write about the future. Imaginary futures, visionary futures, a preferred future. There's a preferred future methodology, which I think is really fascinating, because you take what we have now, what's sort of possible, and push it into a new direction where we want to go. So not that this has to be the authority of what we should do, but I actually think taking some responsibility to imagine a different future and how we might get there would be a fruitful activity for academics, because it's not only questioning knowledge, right, as maybe having not as much value as we would like, but if we're constantly just showing the problems without providing some kind of I wouldn't say solution, but a different imagination about how we could live and what's possible. So, and there are people working on this, and you know, maybe it's a challenge for us, right, to think about that.
I actually think your two comments really helped me sum up what I felt about the day, because we've had both the reality check of saying, recognize the politicization of this field, recognize the gendered and racialized nature of it and the complexity of trying to deal with things. And at the same time, I think you said earlier about thinking about civic repair and the shared futures. Thomas, you referred to solidarity, migrant cosmopolitanism, that it is both about working on the damage control, on the deepening the analysis of the problem, and also lifting our gaze to thinking about and working with people who are creating something alternative to that and needing to do that. So that was sort of my reflections of both your last two comments, but the day as a whole. But we are just a little bit over time, so I'd like to ask if you have any just final thoughts before we close up this panel session, and maybe start with you, Gabriella.
Of course.
Can we, I think, just pass the mic back?
There you go.
I'm kind of going to go really quick back to the last question in terms of building those bridges and building those connections. I think we can actually find some people who are actually interested perhaps only at the personal level, who work within government, who work within these organizations, and who are really willing to listen. And as a collective, we have found a lot of strength on reaching out to the people that perhaps, again, are going to end up blocking our publications, but who can also give you the perspective that you are trying to bring, or an idea of what that environment is like. For us, as a collective, it has been, again, very important to have this opportunity to have this dialogue with UNODC, with UNHCR, with IOM. Very much aware that the overall structure is not going to change, but that we are learning in the process how to communicate with them. that was something that, you know, in the American education system, and I think, you know, overall, you are not taught or trained how to reach out to these audiences and how to even establish a dialogue outside of academia. So, and again, and not only thinking about the policymakers, but also, again, about the people that we work with. How, you know, again, migrants, their communities, our communities, you know, and try also to break those hierarchies. It's not only, again, how do we enter into this dialogue with everyone, not only for, again, trying to break that hegemonic, you know, cycle and pattern that we are all part of, in a sense.
Thank you, Gabriela.
I guess I would say that I think it's really important to create thinking spaces. And I don't want to just say academic spaces, but spaces where people can critically think and brainstorm together, and which have become fewer and further between, you know. At least in my own experience doing activism, there were more of such spaces in the 70s and 80s, and partly the neoliberalization of the university and of life in general has kind of diminished, I think, those spaces. Not that they don't still exist, but for example, I mean, this is an unusual space. It's not a usual space, right? So I think protecting those spaces, not protecting those spaces where they exist, like possibilities within the academy would be one example, fighting these kind of disciplinary walls that are erected, or the sense that you have to pursue a specific discipline in order to make it in academia, and it's becoming harder and harder with the privatization and neoliberalization of academic life for people to make it with more broad thinking skills. Protecting those spaces, but also using those spaces to the extent that we have them within social movements, crossover between academic and social movements within the academy, and never underestimating the role of teaching as a political act, because you never know what's going to come out of your classroom in terms of younger students moving on in the world. And that can be a very happy thing, actually, to realize that you had an impact. So I think we need to protect those spaces, but we also need to project outward from those spaces and be more also visionary and imaginative, because it is really a bleak moment right now, but you know, bleak moments don't last forever, and there's a lot of work to be done. And so I think also just kind of reclaiming the right to energy, and to political energy, and to creative energy, and to you know, thinking energy, just reclaiming that energy in the face of the kind of bleakness and despair at the moment is a worthy political project in and of itself. Thank you.
So I'm also going to take the moment to just make a plug for the Pufendorf Institute. For those of you who are, this is the first interaction with the Pufendorf Institute for Advanced Studies, and if you're at Lund University, the applications are open for themes to create these thinking spaces. Please look at that. Thomas.
I know we're short on time, so I'm just going to make it very, very quick, which is that I agree with all of those things. Speaking of this space, I just wanted to thank again our organizers for organizing this event. This is one thing that I think actually is very important, that what we are doing right now is also something that is needed and important, and frankly one of the most, I mean, for me, very enlightened and genuinely interdisciplinary kinds of conferences or symposiums that I've been to and really gained a lot by listening to it. So thank you all for coming, and thank all the panelists for and thank you for inviting me. I feel like this is a very special event, and something that is more of these kinds of things are needed, because this sort of thing it doesn't happen in philosophy. And I mean, maybe you all go to these more often and you're like, oh yes, interdisciplinary topical things that engage all these scholars. Yeah, we do this all the time. Well, I don't. My world is very disciplined. It's disciplined and it's punished. It's a mess. And I'm thankful to be here, and I really gained a lot from these things.
I just want to echo everything too. I learned a lot from the panel and listening to all the papers and the audience questions as well, so I appreciate that. I would just make a further push for, I mean, not only the imaginary, the shared futures, but to really address this parity idea about, and it has to do with this inclusion of different people into the public space, into the political space, and thinking about kind of political movements and attaching. We've kind of connected all of these things, but I would just echo.
Yeah, fantastic. So for me, it's been an amazing learning experience today, and I would normally thank you and thank the audience, but I'm not going to. I'm going to hand over to Mine, who has really been the architect of today.
Now that we're in the round of thank yous, I would like to thank you, Vasna, for moderating and chairing the second session. I think it was a very hard task to bring all these perspectives together. So starting from you, I would like to introduce our presents and to all of you.
Thank you very much.
Coming all the way. Your carbon emissions and your carbon guilt is on me, but thank you for taking the time and coming all the way from your disciplinary hubs, and we're willing to open up for such a space here. And thank you for all of you for staying so long. The day is over, so enjoy from now on. Thank you. Also, I have one more person that I really have to thank you, David Harnesk, who has been organizing all the logistics and the food, and Eva also, who's been providing us the behind the scenes. Yeah, all the niceness are from her. Thank you very much. And Gisela. Stay, please. Yeah.